The race is set. Anthony Constantino against Blake Gendebien. The first time in more than a decade that there's been no incumbent in the 21st Congressional District. With Elise Stefanik almost out of the picture, how are these two candidates starting their general election campaigns? That's today's story of the day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Pearsall Wealth Management of Raymond James, Glens Falls, offering financial planning and investing advice to clients for over 40 years. Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA, SIPC.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Thursday, July 9th. First up, the State Department of Environmental Conservation is warning people to avoid swimming near an island in Lake George due to concerns about a rabid beaver. The DEC is advising swimmers to avoid the waters around Turtle Island through July 14th due to the potential presence of beavers infected with rabies. It says it's closely monitoring the colony and requests visitors to report any sightings of beavers in the area demonstrating unusual behavior. According to the Times-Union, Brandon Shirtsleeve and his friend were bitten while swimming near Turtle Island last week. After the incident, DEC officers said the beavers may have had rabies. The two victims were taken to the hospital and began receiving rabies vaccinations. A GoFundMe fundraiser was also launched to help cover Shirtsleeve's medical expenses. The DEC says any mammal can become infected with rabies. One sign of infection is a change in behavior, such as an animal becoming unusually aggressive or unusually friendly. State forest rangers have already completed 126 search and rescue missions across the Adirondacks and the North Country this year. Rangers were busy last week with several water rescues. Richard Haller reports.
On July 1st, a hiker fell into the rapids at Auger Falls in the Siamese Ponds Wilderness. Forest rangers located the 38-year-old from Kentucky stranded on a rock in the late evening. They helped the hiker back onto the trail by using a rope and escorted them out of the woods. 2 days later, a 15- and 43-year-old from Redford lost control in rapids while kayaking on the Saranac River. Rangers found them stranded and helped ferry them back to shore with an inflatable kayak. On the same day, a 51-year-old camping at Newcomb Lake injured their hand and lost consciousness. An intern working at the campground alerted forest rangers. When they arrived, the person was conscious and alert. Rangers inspected the wound and transported the subject back to the trailhead. Rangers were also patrolling Lake Champlain that day and found a boat capsized on its side near Willsboro. The wind blew the sailboat over after the rudder came off. Rangers managed to hold the boat upright while its owner repaired the rudder. The DEC reminds people to be extra cautious and take safety measures when recreating in the wilderness. Richard Haller, North Country Public Radio.
The race to replace Congresswoman Elise Stefanik is down to Republican Anthony Constantino and Democrat Blake Gendebien. They each beat out their primary challengers last month and will face off in the November midterms. Our Adirondack reporter Emily Russell's been covering the race, and she caught us up on it on Northern Light this morning with Monica Sandreski.
So first off, let's go back to the primary. What were the main takeaways?
Both of the candidates who won their primaries did so pretty handily. Democrat Blake Gendebien, who's a dairy farmer from St. Lawrence County, beat his opponent by more than 30 points. He's been the front runner on the left for a year and a half now, so that was not a huge surprise. The Republican primary was a little bit more complicated. Assemblyman Robert Smullen had the name recognition. He'd been endorsed by most Republican county committees. But Anthony Constantino, who's the CEO of a sticker company out of Amsterdam, had been endorsed by President Donald Trump, and that proved to be critical. Constantino ended up beating Smullen by 19 points in the Republican primary. Smullen did have the option to run in November on a third-party line, but last week he met with Trump in the Oval Office and ended up dropping out of the race.
So President Trump put his stamp on this race. What have Republican leaders in the North Country done now that the candidate they backed lost the primary?
Well, most county leaders have shifted their endorsements from Smullen to Constantino, including Warren County Republican Committee. Right after the primary, the committee posted on its Facebook page and said that the voters had spoken and that it was time to unite behind Constantino. The state's GOP chair, Ed Cox, who had previously backed Smullen, shared a similar message after the primary and has shifted his endorsement to Constantino. Constantino has also been endorsed by state lawmakers like Senator Dan Steck and Mark Walczyk, and Congresswoman Elise Stefanik congratulated him after the primary. There has been one party, though, that has not endorsed Constantino, and that's the state's Conservative Party. And there's a bit of drama there. Constantino is actually being sued by Conservative Party Chairman Jerry Kassar. That's over an incident that happened last year. Constantino had hoped to appear on the Conservative Party line in November, but Kassar recently said it's in the party's best interest to leave that line blank.
Let's turn now to the general election. It's 4 months away. How has Democrat Blake Gendebien pivoted since the primary?
Gendebien had assumed for months that he'd face Constantino in the general election, so that hasn't really changed his approach to the race. He released his first TV ad this week, which he said was one of his biggest investments his campaign has made so far. But in that ad, he actually didn't single Constantino out and only vaguely referred to President Trump.
Politicians want to spend billions for ballrooms and tax breaks for CEOs, while upstate families just want groceries that won't break the bank. I'm Blake Gendebien, and I'm not a politician. I know hard work and what's important to help my neighbors get ahead.
So he's really framing himself as a moderate in this race, as the farmer from Lisbon, as someone who's focused on things like affordability. I think Gendebien's goal with that broad message is to win over some independent and Republican voters in November.
Well, with that in mind, Gendebien had hoped to appear on multiple party lines in the upcoming midterms. That plan fell through, though. Briefly, what happened there?
Yeah, he was trying to appear both on the Democratic line and on the lower costs now line. But Constantino's campaign challenged that effort. And last week, the State Board of Elections ruled that hundreds of Gendebien's signatures were invalid. So he'll only appear once on the ballot in November. Meanwhile, Constantino will appear twice on both the Republican line and on the taxpayers' rights line. And as a reminder, he had hoped to appear on a third time on the ballot on the state's Conservative Party line, but the party decided to keep that line blank.
So how has Constantino turned to the general election and his Democratic opponent?
Yeah, he's super active on social media. He's lobbed attacks against Gendebien. He was actually the focus over the last few weeks of a satirical segment on The Daily Show. But he's really tried to push two main messages. One is of unity within the Republican Party. He's been meeting with Republican committee chairs from places like Fulton, Montgomery, and Saratoga counties. He also published a campaign ad last week.
I'm not a typical politician. I wasn't an establishment guy. And we've seen President Trump time after time back people that are different in this election. They've all won.
And the second message that Constantino has been pushing is that Democrats, mainly in New York City, are the true opponents in this race. It's kind of similar to the way that Stefanik and Trump once did. Constantino has targeted Mayor Zoran Mamdani as the enemy rather than focusing on his opponent, Blake Gendebien. So we'll have to see how well that strategy plays out.
So Stefanik has held this seat for over a decade. She's won every election with a double-digit margin. What do we know about the odds between Constantino and Gendebien?
So we know that Republicans far outnumber Democrats in this district. There are 81,000 more Republicans in the North Country than there are Democrats. Cook Political Report rates this district as solidly Republican. So to be clear, this is a really uphill battle for Gendebien. Democrats had hoped that Smullen would stay in the race and split the Republican ticket, but of course he dropped out, so there's now an even clearer path for Constantino. But there are a lot of independent voters in this district. There are actually more voters who aren't registered with any party than there are registered Democrats. Gendebien's campaign recently paid for a poll by a left-leaning research group. It found that he was within just 1 point of Constantino, so 44 to 45%. 11% of voters from that poll were undecided. But again, that's from a left-leaning research group. And one last thing I want to note is about voter turnout from the primaries. It was around 20% on the Republican side. And for the Democrats, just 11% turned out to vote in the primaries. So that presents a huge hurdle for the Democrats who are hoping really against all odds to flip this district in November.
That's our reporter Emily Russell speaking this morning on Northern Light with Monica Sandreski. Music today by Christopher Watts of Canton and Steve Hamilton of Potsdam. I'm David Sommerstein, North Country Public Radio.